the affirmative and transformative. And then we're going to be looking at some excerpts from data and seeing how we can apply her framework to that. So she just gives some examples of social injustice. She says, historically, many white heterosexual women have lacked standing and resources to participate in official politics while enjoying cultural and material prerequisites for participating meaningfully, if not fully equally, in family life, whereas homosexuals have until very recently lacked the standing to participate openly in sexual relations and family life, even in contexts where some of them have had access to decently remunerated work. So you can see the representation and, not representation, the economic and the cultural there, the recognition. So, in such cases, exclusion remains contained in a given sphere or set of spheres and doesn't spill over. In other cases, however, exclusion is highly convertible, spreading freely from sphere to sphere, like the Nazi treatment of Jews, and we had apartheid, where people are systematically stripped of participation in all spheres until they lost the very right to exist. And she gives different scenarios of injustice. So in one scenario, exclusion is grounded in the political economy, as when economic structures deny some categories of actors even the minimal economic resources that are needed. And then in the second scenario, exclusion is rooted in a status order that's in misrecognition, when the institutionalization of a hierarchical pattern of cultural value denies some the chance for even second-class citizenship in some areas. And this is what were known as pariah groups. In the third, exclusion is grounded in the political constitution of society, as when the architecture of political space denies some people the chance to even have a marginal say in disputes about justice. This is misframing. This is the situation of undocumented immigrants in many countries. In the fourth scenario, exclusion arises from a combined operation of culture and political economy, as when class differentials map onto status hierarchies to prevent some actors from participating in all mainstream areas of social interaction. This is the position of some indigenous peoples in settler societies. This is the example we had of South Africa, for example, and of the Romani people in Eastern and Central Europe. In the fifth scenario, exclusion is rooted jointly in all three dimensions of social ordering, as when economic, cultural, and political structures work together to obstruct participation. And this is the position of the global poor. Yeah.
I think that's very significant.
Yeah.
Is poverty?
Yes. Yeah.
Implicated.
So what are the difference between affirmative and transformative approaches? Well, affirmative contests boundaries of existing frames, but basically accepts the Westphalian grammar of frame setting. It redraws existing boundaries or creates new ones, but it still thinks that the territorial state is the appropriate unit to pose and to resolve justice disputes. So in the paper that Chrissy, Bowie, and myself wrote, we were looking at how higher education is misframed by people looking at individual institutions and making judgments about those institutions without looking at the inequalities of the entire system. So it's a misframing of the problem to begin with. It's making the boundaries around those individual institutions, saying, oh, well, this university is lacking. Not looking at, the university down the road and how that is affecting, who's getting which students and who has what resources, that sort of thing. So transformative is while state territorial principle remains relevant for some purposes, it isn't so in all cases. The structural causes of injustices in a globalizing world include financial markets, offshore factories, global economy, information networks, like the digital divide, the climate issues, diseases, drugs, weapons, biotechnology. And this is what Emmanuel Castells calls not the spaces of places, but the spaces of flows. It's what's flowing between these spaces. Transformative politics of framing changes the frame setting in a globalizing world. So we're not looking at the boundaries within a particular country, we're looking at what she calls the all-affected principle. It's everyone who is affected by a particular issue, like indigenous peoples, like colonization, for example. So all those affected by a social structure or institution have a moral standing as subjects of social justice in relation to it, not in terms of geographic proximity, but the fact that they are all affected by a framework which sets the rules governing their social interaction and which shapes their life chances of advantage and disadvantage. So environmental issues, for example, would fall under this. They are affecting people across, the world. It's not to do with state territorial boundaries. Yes, and indigenous peoples, have a lot in common across the world. You can see the same sort of issues that people are having to deal with. For example, a lot of indigenous peoples are in prison in various colonial contexts. As Fraser says, it's the new form of slavery, a much worse form of slavery. What would help is to seek to change the grammar of and democratize frame setting and make it dialogical. So the democratization of bringing people to the table to let them have a say, giving collective voice to those who've been harmed by these sort of processes. And then I just had this sort of diagram for myself, trying to make sense of affirmative versus transformative processes in misrecognition, maldistribution, and misframing. So for an affirmative process in misrecognition, you would have multiculturalism. So you are sort of acknowledging and valuing all cultures. Well, for transformative, you'd have deconstruction of those binary opposites. In terms of maldistribution, you would have an affirmative approach would be the liberal welfare state, which is redistributing sort of income in a limited way. And then transformative, you would have a deep restructuring of society, what she calls her now expanded view of socialism. And then misframing, it still assumes the legitimacy of the territorial state, whereas transformative changes the boundaries of justice and how the boundaries are drawn, in these like ecological movements, etc., etc. And these are just further examples. I don't think I'm going to go into them now because you can just read them in your own time. I will give Lynn these slides. Just the last thing that I thought we could do is I listened to a talk of Fraser, which was done on May the 8th at the University of Washington. And in fact, we've brought this into our book. She has written a book called The Crisis of Capitalism. And then I've got another little book by her, see if I can find it here, which is a 2019 here it is.
Literally,
the old is dying and the new cannot be born. But I'm sure she's working on more books. because I think she has been critiqued of not bringing colonialism into her work. And as somebody in my book, the book that we're working on, was critiquing her about ecological issues. Because if people now are not bringing the ecological issues into injustice, then, you know, it's really problematic. So what's interesting is that she's gone back to this notion of social reproduction, which is what interested me in the first place in Fraser. And she says we need an expanded notion or enlarged view of the capitalist crisis and an expanded notion of socialism. So she says it's not only, socialism is not only economic, it's beyond that. And she brings in these four things. She says, firstly, there's a social reproductive crisis where capital tries to avoid paying for unwaged care work, the very activity on which it depends. It does not acknowledge this, and recruits massively women into waged work of long hours of grueling, low-paid service. And this is where you get a sort of Filipino woman working in America. Here, domestic workers, a lot of people are freed up to do what they want to do because they're paying people much less to look after, adults and children at home, etc. Secondly, she talks about the ecological crisis, where capital tries to avoid paying the full replacement costs of the inputs it takes from nature, resulting in things like soil depletion, resource depletion, depletion of the atmosphere, carbon carrying capacity. So capital helps itself to all these things without accounting for their ecological reproduction. And it assumes nature is infinite and can replenish itself ad infinitum. So here she talks about extractivism, and extractivism is something that people are talking about a lot now. And instrumentalization. I think that this is an issue which has become more and more prominent in the field of injustice. And if we don't concentrate on this, there will be no humans anyhow to consider. So I think, for her to have not been talking about this was quite problematic. And people are also critical of Fraser because they said it's not just capitalism, that has caused the ecological crisis. But others are, I don't know if you've heard about the term the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is acknowledging that humans have damaged the earth. Anthropos is human. But some people talk about the Capitalocene, because they say, no, it's largely capitalism that has caused the demise, this continued obsession with growth at the expense of the environment. And yet others talk about the Plantationocene, which is saying that, no, it's slave labor. And it's greed in terms of wanting huge tracts of land for agriculture and for cows and that sort of thing, which has caused the environmental issues. I actually wrote to Nancy Fraser and said, did you see that critique of you? She said, yes, I'm going to address it later. It was some black scholar who was saying, no, it's not just, capital. And then capitalism's tendency to ecological and social reproductive crises are inseparable from its reliance on expropriated wealth from racialized people, and its reliance on stolen lands, constrained and coerced bodies, confiscated labor, confiscated animals, tools, reproductive capacities, its reliance on racialized regions and zones as a dumping ground for its toxic waste, hence environmental racism, and global care chains where it imports cheap reproductive labor to reproduce work previously done without pay for working mothers. So here we see the intertwining of the ecological and the economic, social reproduction and the racial, ethnic antagonisms, a new form of crisis. I really think that these things are hugely important and, haven't been written enough about as forms of injustice. So, and finally, we can't avoid mentioning capital's proclivity to generate political crises, both crises of governance, crises of hegemony. Capitalism likes to have it both ways. It lives off public goods while trying to avoid paying taxes and to weaken state regulatory capacity to hollow out public power. So these, she says, globally mega corporations now discipline states. So I think, I find this attractive, and if you are interested, you should listen to her latest talks. Because she's, this is what it's about. And so we tried to bring that into the last chapter of our book, yet to see what she thinks of it. Just in terms of references, Fraser is quite prolific, as you can see, and I'm sure these are not all her references. So she's, it's no wonder she's the #1 quoted person, maybe not in her field, but in political philosophy. She continues to produce. And then just, I have put our forthcoming, the 2 chapters in our book, which, if people who are working on Fraser would like access to, maybe we could give it, but we couldn't, couldn't share it or quote from it, or maybe you could say forthcoming, I don't know. And then Brenda Leibovitz and I looked at the foundation provision from a Fraser perspective, and also at the scholarship of teaching and learning. And then I think people are okay. I did also, this person, Tessa Hochfeld, who's also just died in a cycling accident. Her and I wrote about the child support grant and using Fraser. And and then Faiza Khan, a PhD student of mine, wrote about students' experiences of residence life. And I do have another student looking at pedagogies and using Nancy Fraser. So, I would just like to hear from people in the room, just to end off. And also, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask. But I'd very much like to hear from people who are using Fraser, in what ways are you using it, and how useful you find it. Sue?
I have read that everything that you gave, that long list, and as you say, it's probably not even a complete list of Fraser's publications, but in my limited reading of her, she definitely seems to talk about misframing in terms of the global sphere, in terms of the Westphalian state, geopolitical borders. But you seem to be more willing to use it at a smaller level. Like misframing of, certainly you've used it in terms of misframing of institutions.
And
I think I'm right that you've used it in terms of misframing of individuals. So
I'm not sure I've used it in terms of individuals.
Okay.
Can't remember. Maybe I have.
So what I'm asking is, can we use this concept of misframing? Because I think it's a really powerful concept to make sense of sometimes individual interactions, and not to leave them at, because I know she won't deal with the level of affect and emotion or whatever. Other people do that. Bartlett, Sibelius, other people allow us to talk to that. But doesn't the notion of misframing still help us at a more macro level?
I'm just trying to think because, you know, if one goes back to her definition of social justice as making social arrangements
Yes.
possible. Well, as social arrangements can also be within a classroom. Well, you know, sort of, are you, in the way in which you're teaching, are you making it possible for people who are differently placed along a sort of, what's it called, spectrum, to engage? So I would call that, you know, making social arrangements in terms of teaching. I suppose it's not only in terms of policy. But we were talking, I think, in your absence of, say, misframing being sort of not having the arrangements at a university to accommodate difference or disability or something like that. So you're excluding groups of people. So I would rather say that, you know, it's whether you're accommodating, you enabling everyone in that situation to participate equally. Because we are starting off from, you know, the understanding is that we are all differently placed. You know, we're coming in with different knowledges, we're coming in with different abilities. So how, in the way in which you teach, can you accommodate, can you take difference as normative, rather than sort of the unencumbered, white, sort of economic, able-bodied, middle-class male? Yes.
I wanted to ask a question too, just about the frameworks and using Nancy Fraser. I think that, as you were pointing out, that it is a normative framework, and so when she's talking about developing a grammar of justice, I wondered whether you thought that this was going in the direction of something was like a deontological approach, a procedure-based. And for me, the struggle that I had about this was when she starts with this Westphalian state-based and then moves towards this idea of the global.
All affected. Yeah.
All affected, but it is still same sort of thinking of all affected, whether it was first in the state, but it's now the global. That, for me, kind of carries a pathway or a trace of this liberal democratic order that has just been expanded greatly, and it's now territorial but global still. And for me, that metapolitical democracy idea is a bit decontextualized, and I struggle very much also with this deontological sort of blind justice that has no being, that is trying to find the perfect procedure where you don't. So for me, that very much, as you pointed out, it's very difficult to talk about individual or life psychic damage. So for me, those were some of the problems. You know.
Yeah, I think that one has to recognize those limitations. And I think when she talks about the grammar, the who, the how, and whatever, she's talking about who gets to come to the table, you know, to decide what the issues are. For example, do dependent people have the or do caregivers, are they included, you know, in coming to the table to decide, you know, what arrangements can be made, or are those people excluded from that? So, I do think that one would have to turn elsewhere, but I must say I do, you know, when everyone else has sort of lost faith in socialism, I mean, we don't sort of have, there are no alternatives around. I sort of quite like her going back to this expanded view of socialism. And I think these are very particular issues that we can do, that social movements can do something about. And I think she's she does speak about how social movements can be used to make such changes, not only nationally but across contexts. And I think that the problem is that people feel isolated in their particular. They sort of feel, well, this is just their struggle. But if they put in touch, with people that have similar issues across contexts, the movement could be stronger. I don't know if that's answering any of your questions. She also says, that Europe is continuing to benefit from this expropriated wealth, and that there isn't this recognition that they are there because of the colonies, because of suffering. And I think this is the case also if one looks at for example, higher education institutions in South Africa. Those who are in privileged positions are there because the UWCs are taking those other students that they do not have to take. And because they have so there has to be some recognition in order to move forward. So who is using Nancy Fraser? Besides Bella, we know Bella. Are you using her? So you are critiquing her, but you,
Yes.
I mean, you have issues. She is operating out of that frame, and she's very upfront about it, I think.
Do you want to just tell us how you're using it?
So I'm looking at teacher education and social cohesion, and how teachers are prepared for that, and I'm looking at elite institution. But I started with Nancy Fraser and then have come up against some of the the limits that I've been thinking about. I'm just trying to work through that now.
And isn't that important to do? To
also,
acknowledge the limits of
is,
any framework that you use.
Yeah, but I also think that she, in looking at her more recent work, you can see, I find it, this is interesting. And, these more recent ones might expropriation and exploitation and racialized capitalism. So I think you might find something more in those, actually, that's more palatable and also more applicable to this particular context.
Thank you.
Anyone else using her?
Well, as you know that I am using her, but I find that I need other people to come in to assist.
Yes,
That's
which
why,
is quite fine.
yes, that is why I also use Excel Honey to answer some of the questions that Fraser is not answering. Or I don't, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
I don't mind to say that.
A doctoral scholar.
And then I also, like I said earlier, I find that Miranda Africa is also complimenting her to enable me to answer the questions that I have about my study. So I don't think Fraser is the one person,
Yeah,
for me, I don't know for the other people, can really function as the only person.
yeah. Thanks. That's useful. Yeah, although she does sort of bring into misrecognition sort of disqualified knowledges, knowledges that haven't been come into being as being given light, you know. I think Fricka takes that further, yeah. And they work quite well together, using Fricka and Fraser. I've also seen Fricka being used together with care ethics. And there's a woman, actually Karen Maris has used Fricka quite a lot in her book, The Post-Human Child, which is based on South African work.
Karen?
Maris.
Spell
Murris. She's got a whole chapter on Fricka. Yeah. I thought Anita had a question. Yes.
Thank you so much for the whole presentation. For me, I was owing to read Nancy Fraser. So I am looking at historically disadvantaged institutions and how they use student development funding for students. So I was reading more of critical theory from Prof, but now I have an idea if I can't, perhaps, can I combine the two?
I'm sure, yeah.
To answer some of these issues that are taking place. So I think that's how I'm going to begin unpacking, because Paulo Freire only explains what is happening, but doesn't necessarily give me answers on how the way forward and how to do
Yeah.
it.
I think Fraser provides quite a good sort of analytical
Yes.
tool to use. Yeah. I would say that they're compatible. Shall we go into looking at these excerpts? So I'm going to hand out an excerpt. If you can just read and start making notes of what you think is going on in terms of the recognition, misrecognition, maldistribution, which aspects do these cover, and also the affirmative and transformative. So initially just go through it yourself, and then once you've gone through it, you can have a discussion in your group.